Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Let's see here. There we go. Today's YouTube lecture is going to be on free jazz and some more of the avant-garde sort of movements that arose in the 50s and the 60s in jazz. And we're also going to talk about John Coltrane just a little bit, his place in all of this, as well as how it got started and that kind of stuff. Right now, starting with today's material, this will be the first bit of material towards your final exam. So all of the stuff from previous exams, predecessors to jazz, ragtime, blues, stuff like that, Dixieland swing era, bebop, cool, third stream, modal, hard bop, all that stuff you can kind of put away for the most part. And this will be the majority of the material on your upcoming final will be from this point forward. So hopefully that's helpful for you as well. Okay. That was from last episode. All right, here we go. All right. So let's start. Let's start chatting about this. Okay. With all of these changes we've had fairly rapidly after the swing era in the late 40s and 50s, just heading into the 60s as well, early 60s, with the rise of cool jazz being pretty popular, West Coast cool, hard bop being a reaction sort of against that to try to wrestle jazz back to the African American community in particular, away from sort of the watered down white jazz of the West Coast scene. The Latin influences, the third stream stuff, all those changes happening, pretty quickly in like a 15-year span, or new developments coming out. Eventually you got to these even more experimental things, which is really our topic of most of our stuff today. Okay. So avant-garde jazz is a sort of an umbrella term, and it covers a whole lot of material that is really hard to classify, really experimental, oftentimes really pushing the boundaries as far as what people are trying to do and what people are willing to sort of consume as a listener. And free jazz is, you will see in a video clip, really just that. It is all of the structures and the sort of self-imposed boundaries that jazz musicians have been using up until this point, particularly with forms and sort of harmonies and chord changes. Like there's the 12-bar blues, and there's three different chords, and they change at specific times, right? Or if it's a modal jazz, and there's fewer chords, but they do change at specific times. Or if it's something really complicated like bebop, where there's a harmonic progression of chords, and everybody knows when those chords change, right? Free jazz is the elimination of those sorts of things. Why are we using these chords? Let's try something without chords. Let's try something without a steady rhythm. Let's try improvising completely free of any of the structures we've traditionally used in jazz music. That's really what that is. I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on some of the clips from Ken Burns here, because I really feel like this music really needs to be consumed and understood through that perspective more than I can just explain it to you. This is oftentimes kind of far out, and so you really need to kind of there needs to be a lot of reinforcement. So I'm gonna let those video clips really reinforce this a lot too. Okay. All right. So in regards to this music, it may contain some of these things. An extension of the jazz tradition, not necessarily breaking from it. Traditionalists would say it is not jazz, or you've broken with the tradition of jazz. The musicians that were involved in this would argue, no, we're not breaking with the jazz tradition. We're taking it further along the evolutionary chain. You can decide, okay? Generally, an avoidance of preset chord progressions. Again, for this entire time we've been talking about this music, there is a preset harmonic structure, and they're not using it. Collective improvisation makes a return. We haven't talked specifically about collective improvisation really since the Dixieland days, and that becomes more of a thing now. Multiple instrumentalists improvising at the same time. You can get multiple jazz styles in a given piece. They can kind of switch back and forth between different things. Unconventional means of playing traditional instruments. The musicians involved in this sort of stuff are oftentimes looking for innovative methods of playing, innovative sounds, and so you will get unusual things. And of course, all of this, you get this battle of sort of traditionalists versus the new guard, and they're going to butt heads quite a bit here. So, and again, you'll see a lot of this in sort of those clips. Okay, the free jazz craze, if you will, is launched with the arrival of Ornette Coleman. Ornette Coleman was an alto saxophone player. He believed that he was sort of taking Charlie Parker's innovations and then extending them further. So he learned to play in the bebop tradition, and was trying to get jazz to continue along that plane, but with more harmonic freedom, without necessarily the preset chord progressions. As you'll see in a clip, he joined with a bunch of musicians from Southern California, Don Cherry, Charlie Hayden, and they ended up working around playing in this free idiom. Again, not necessarily with any particular standard forms or with any particular chord progressions or any even particular rhythms. What is the role of a bass player? It's to provide some momentum and outline the harmonic structure. Well, if you don't have a harmonic structure, what's the bass player going to do, right? The drum set player can play instead of in 4/4 time, keeping a steady beat and perhaps being part of the dialogue. Now you don't really need the steady beat. So what does the drummer do? How does the drummer play? These sorts of things, right? The landmark recording that people sort of talk about, although there were many other recordings before it that were sort of leading to this, but in 1960, he recorded an album called Free Jazz, which was a double quartet. So it was the Ornette Coleman Quartet plus another quartet of sympathetic musicians, and they recorded an album where there's lots of collective improvisation at times. At times, it's individuals. The chord progressions were altered, however they wanted to do it. It's one song. The song is titled Free Jazz. The type of jazz is called free jazz, but the song on this album, the album Free Jazz, the one song is called Free Jazz, and it's 36 minutes long. It takes up both sides of the record. I'm going to provide a link to YouTube to that entire album. I don't expect you to listen to all of it. You might find that very challenging, but I do want you to consume as much of it as you can handle, and just sort of get an understanding, and again, compare it to everything else we've listened to up until this point. This is less melodic, less tuneful, it seems less organized, and it's different, and it is going down a different avenue, that's for sure. Okay. The term free jazz polarized the community. Again, traditionalists versus the new wave. A lot of people thought that what Coleman was doing was just a bunch of BS. And you have to kind of understand, Ornette Coleman was sort of working in, he wasn't getting a lot of attention early on as he was doing this in California. And then he suddenly sort of burst onto the scene with this new thing developed, and a lot of people didn't know about him. He didn't kind of come up the traditional ranks, so they thought some people thought, is this a joke? Is he making fun of us? What is this stuff, right? But it did seem to work for Ornette Coleman and his group, and they were, relatively popular to a certain crowd. As you can see, they had a 2-week engagement at the 5 Spot, which was a club that was willing to work with experimental musicians and try new things. And it was actually extended to 6 months. So there was definitely a community in New York City that was willing to tough it out with Ornette Coleman and stick with it and see what would develop. Right? There's a pretty substantial clip on Ornette Coleman that will also tell this story. And again, I'm uploading the song "Free Jazz," which is 36 minutes long. Which again, you do not need to listen to all of it, but check out enough of it to sort of get the collective improvisation, to get the lack of a cohesive chord progression or form, sort of, and just sort of see what you think about it. Okay, so Ornette Coleman is really one of the guys that the free jazz movement centers on, although other people did it as well. You're also going to see a short clip on Cecil Taylor. Cecil Taylor was a piano player and a composer, and he came to jazz as a sort of virtuosic, classically trained piano player. He went to the New England Conservatory of Music, which is in Boston. Some of the finest musicians in the world come out of that place, right? He actually taught and held residencies at a number of fairly well-known universities, including the University of Wisconsin, right there, for a brief time. And Cecil Taylor fancied himself an innovator and was creating complex music, taking music again in different directions. For example, the majority of what we've listened to up until this point, improvisations are really based on melodies and sort of melodic patterns and things like that. So if you learn how to listen for stuff, you can follow what the improvisers are doing a little bit. Cecil Taylor, I'm sorry, tried new things. He was basing his improvisation on texture, which means you won't really be whistling his music. You will not be humming along or singing along. You will hear a tremendous amount of dissonance sometimes. And those are sort of the textures he's working with. It is very much a challenge to listen to. He recognized it as such. And again, this was a bridge too far for many, many people. So Cecil Taylor did not work a tremendous amount. He did record some albums and did get some support. And as you can see, taught at places, but his music is a little further, or for many people, a lot further actually than they were willing to go. So I'm going to upload one Cecil Taylor example, a piece called Unit Structures, which you can just sort of, again, get a taste of and see what you think. And, just think, would you go to a club if this guy was playing, that kind of stuff, right? Clearly a major alternative to more mainstream jazz, more traditional jazz. His music does not usually swing. You're certainly not going to dance to this stuff. Oftentimes, again, without preset chord changes or a regular tempo. Sometimes the music is atonal. Atonal music, or atonality, is music without a key or a key center. So it's not in F. It's not in B minor. It's not in a key. It's all over the place, basically. Cecil Taylor, the musicians that worked with him in his small groups, he actually had to, they had to kind of train with him to learn how to play his music properly. So it's really sort of a deep level of commitment to this one particular gentleman's style of music. So check out, obviously you'll see some more of this on the video clip about Cecil Taylor, and check out the Unit Structures tune that I'm going to put on Moodle for you. And again, just kind of take it in and compare it to things that were happening before, right? This is really spreading out and stretching jazz into going further and further into certain directions, which again is sort of making the music more and more intellectual and less popular. Okay. Another group, which again you will see a video clip on, is the Art Ensemble of Chicago. They were a collective group of artists. They wrote a lot of their own music, led by the trumpet player Lester Bowie. They brought in world music. They brought in some theatrics, in a sense. They wore some of the artists wore makeup. Lester Bowie always wore like a white lab coat when he was playing. I don't really know why that is. But they played all kinds of different things, and they would mash it all together. They could play Dixieland jazz. They could play swing. They could play bebop. They could also play a lot of free jazz, and all of this stuff would sort of be presented in a new sort of what they deemed as sort of concertized way, instead of playing a club where people would grab their drinks and sit down and tap their toes and listen. This becomes more of a concertized version where you would see them in a concert hall or a recital hall type of thing. More of a presentation of the music in a sense, often including drama and poetry. And as you will see again from the short little video clip about them, not tremendously popular. So I'll upload a little example of our Ensemble of Chicago as well, to kind of coincide with that stuff. And again, just take it in and kind of think about where the music is going in the late 60s, in particular, mid to late 60s, cresting into the 70s. Eventually what's going to happen here is, there's still more traditional jazz being played, but this kind of stuff is also, they're going in a lot of different directions here. And eventually it's a new type of jazz called fusion is going to arrive, and that's going to kind of blow everything out and just sort of press reset. And then we're going to kind of start over. There'll almost be a rebirth in a sense. But right at this point, we're sort of getting further and further away. All right. The last person I want to share with you, you actually won't see a video clip of, but I will share with you a couple of examples, or at least one, of a gentleman by the name of Sun Ra. His real name was Herman Sonny Blount, and he was a piano player. He actually played with Fletcher Henderson and Coleman Hawkins, not in the 1920s when Fletcher Henderson led the best black band in the country, but much later, sort of in the 40s, when Mr. Blount was a young man. But he has these links with old school traditional jazz, is I guess the point I'm trying to prove here. He legally changed his name to Sun Ra in 1953, and he would tell people he was born on Saturn, and he was 700 years old, and he was connected with cosmic things. And there's a theme to a lot of his music, which is really just, and I'm really simplifying it here. So, but in a sense, there's a theme that is the world used to be a peaceful and wonderful place, and then some bad people showed up, and they brought with them war and disease and famine and that kind of stuff. So the original inhabitants of this beautiful place left, and they went out into space. And it's been centuries and eons and millennia, and now they're coming back, and they are going to show people how to return to peace and beauty and all that kind of stuff, that kind of stuff. And you could generally paint this. You could generally see how this refers to essentially the black community was peaceful and wonderful, and then the white man came and messed everything up, and now the black folks are coming back and showing people how it used to be done. Right? It's that kind of thing. There are similar thematic things in some pop music artists as well, of the 70s. Parliament was a funk group, and they did a similar thing with they had an album called Mothership Connection, and the leader George Clinton was had one of his nicknames was Star Child, and they would talk about returning to Earth and sort of bringing back what was good and showing people how to get funky and groovy again, and all will be well, that kind of stuff. Sun Ra had a similar take, and in fact, they made a movie called "Space is the Place," and I'm actually I'll provide a link to that. Again, you do not need to watch all of it, but you might enjoy some of it. In addition to some examples of his music, he started an orchestra, not an orchestra, but an orchestra in the mid '50s, and it started out as sort of a traditional or somewhat traditional big band swing, but they evolved into what he called cosmic jazz. Later venturing into free jazz and embracing technology. Sun Ra was actually one of the first jazz musicians to embrace electronic instruments, which we'll actually talk about in an upcoming lecture with Miles Davis going towards fusion. But Sun Ra was sort of in that game early on too. So enjoy the Sun Ra offerings is, I guess, what I want to say. And again, just compare it to other things that were going on in the late 50s and the early 60s. Okay, so here, these are just a couple of examples of either free jazz or avant-garde type artists. You don't need to differentiate between free jazz or avant-garde. Avant-garde, in a sense, is an umbrella term that is anything sort of experimental and innovative, and free jazz could fit in that category. So these are just, again, some examples. And the video clips, I think, are really helpful in sort of laying the groundwork for this sort of music as well. Okay, so this brings me to our last topic here, and that is John Coltrane. Now, grouping John Coltrane with free jazz and avant-garde might seem strange, but John Coltrane's later career was very much sort of in the avant-garde, not necessarily doing anything particularly unusual, but his music just sort of evolved and became more and more challenging and more, you'll hear the term like spiritual, in a sense, that it evolved very naturally into this experimental, sort of hard to consume language, which is quite a bit different than where he started, and that's for sure. So again, there'll be a nice little clip on John Coltrane, and we've already talked about him a little bit, particularly his work with Miles Davis. But if I can take him out of context a little and just give you a bit more of an overview of John Coltrane's career, he's really one of the monumental figures in post-bebop jazz. He's born, as you can see, 1926. Raised in North Carolina, moved as a teenager to Philadelphia. Again, sort of a great migration, leaving small town south, into a more urban area for better opportunities for his family. He joined the Navy right after, or either right before or right after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so the war was essentially over at that point. He did not see combat, but he did get to serve in Oahu, Hawaii. And while he was there, he played in a little Navy band called the Melody Masters. And so he served for a year, from August 6th to August 11th of the following year. And that allowed him to take advantage of the GI Bill, which he went to school at various sort of small music school type conservatory things in the Philadelphia area. He played in Dizzy Gillespie's big band for a while. That was a bebop big band. He played with Miles Davis. Miles Davis hired him in 1955, fired him 2 years later because at that point Miles Davis was clean. He had kicked heroin, but John Coltrane very much had not, and had started to become unreliable and have all of these sort of issues that goes along with a heroin addiction. To clean himself up, John Coltrane, obviously getting fired by Miles Davis was probably a wake-up call in a sense. He started playing with Thelonious Monk and starting to put his own groups together, all of which helped lead him on kind of back to the straight and narrow. He became, there's a lot of talk or a lot of sort of legend about John Coltrane's spirituality. He studied Eastern religions, the music of India, that kind of stuff. He became a very spiritual person, and he began to write a lot of music that expressed that. and you'll get some of that here in momentarily. He recorded his debut album and a very well-known record called Blue Train in 1957. Blue Train is got a ton of sort of classic stuff on it, and at this point he was again hired by Miles Davis. Miles Davis brought him back in 1958, and that was sort of when they put together the John Coltrane was part of Miles Davis's first quintet, and then Miles Davis kind of fired everybody, and then he went to work on the Third Stream albums, and then he brought everybody back, and it became a sextet. He added Cannonball Adderley, and then it became a sextet, and they tried that modal jazz experiment, which was kind of blue, right? So this is around the same time. So Coltrane is now making his own records as a leader. Miles Davis brings him back in 1958, but by 1960, John Coltrane had become a big enough star that he left Miles Davis for good and just started his own groups and led his own thing. But sort of in that time, just to show you the diversity of what John Coltrane was doing, in 1959, he records that modal jazz masterpiece, Kinda Blue, which is the very slow chord changes and sort of stagnant harmonic language. Meanwhile, he makes his own record called Giant Steps, which is an album, but it's also a song. It's the title track of the album, Giant Steps. Giant Steps is historically some of the most challenging harmonic language in any jazz piece. It's sort of like it's like the finish line for a lot of jazz musicians. They work their way up until they can play Giant Steps. It's extremely complex. So in the same year, he does very, very simplified harmonic language with Kinda Blue, and the complete other end of the spectrum, which is absolutely the most challenging harmonic language to that date, which is Giant Steps. Just to kind of show you what John Coltrane is about at this time in his history, right? So he works with Miles Davis until about 1960. He then starts his own quartet. The classic John Coltrane quartet was McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums. You'll see some footage of them playing on the video clips. Made a lot of classic records, including in 1964, perhaps the best-known Coltrane album, along with Blue Train, is a record called A Love Supreme. And I just, again, to sort of bring together sort of his spiritual nature, I wanted to provide you this information here. This is from the liner notes of A Love Supreme. So during the year 1957, this is when he was fired by Miles Davis and started working with Monk and starting to clean himself up and that kind of stuff. During the year 1957, I experienced by the grace of God a spiritual awakening which has led me to a richer, fuller, more productive life. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. I feel this has been granted through His grace. It's a very modest statement. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked, things like that. I feel this has been granted through His grace. It kind of paints a picture of who John Coltrane was and what he sort of became. And you'll get, again, some of this in the Ken Burns footage as well. Later, near the end of his career, he had a second quartet which featured his second wife, Alice Coltrane, on the piano. Jimmy Garrison stayed on bass, and a younger drummer by the name of Rashid Ali replaced Elvin Jones. Unfortunately, John Coltrane passed away in 1967 from liver cancer, more than likely complicated by all of the drug use and that sort of stuff that happened earlier in his life. So Coltrane's journey into the avant-garde, in a sense, was much more organic and much more natural. If you compare it with Ornette Coleman worked on his craft outside of the mainstream. So when he arrived in New York with the free jazz and it was very explosive, a lot of people thought, this is a joke, what's going on, right? But Coltrane was very much in traditional jazz circles, working with the first Miles Davis quintet, and before that, Dizzy Gillespie and that kind of stuff. So people saw and sort of heard and could follow John Coltrane's development into this more challenging, more far-reaching, more experimental, more spiritual, in a sense, music. So he was never really criticized for taking his music in this direction. I'm going to provide a couple of John Coltrane's for you. I'll provide early John Coltrane. I'll actually put up the song Blue Train from early on, but then I'll provide some later things. You'll get a little bit of Love Supreme. I will provide a link to the album Ascension, which is kind of like free jazz by Ornette Coleman. It is a collective group. One very long song that runs about 40 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, and there's just a lot of very experimental, sort of groundbreaking sounds pushing this in new directions. And again, typically, even though with a big name like John Coltrane, that tends to be not as popular as some of his other material, like Giant Steps or Blue Train or A Love Supreme. So there you have it, folks. That's kind of a really brief overview of some of the avant-garde practices of the late 50s and the 60s, free jazz in particular, and John Coltrane. We could spend a lot more time on John Coltrane, but I think this and the clips you will see will kind of help lay the groundwork and paint that picture for you, okay? So check out all those other materials. Check out the film clips that coincide with it, and I will see you guys next time. All right, thanks so much. Bye-bye.